"Master, how can we soften the hearts that are as hard as stone?" Peter asked, his voice thick with frustration. Little did he know the answer he sought would transform the way they viewed the most stubborn obstacles they faced, both in the world and within themselves. It was a warm and peaceful afternoon in Galilee. The sun had climbed high in the sky, casting its radiant golden light over the hills and valleys, illuminating the fields of wheat and olive trees that swayed gently in the wind. The Sea of Galilee shimmered in the distance like a sheet of glass, reflecting the clear blue sky above. Jesus and his disciples had gathered under the shade of a large ancient olive tree on the hillside. The tree's broad branches reached out like a canopy, providing a refuge from the heat of the day. Yet, despite the cool shade and the beauty of the landscape, the disciples were troubled. They had just returned from a nearby village, where their efforts to spread the message of the kingdom of heaven had been met with resistance and indifference. The villagers had turned away from their words, their hearts seemingly closed to the love and hope that the disciples had tried so hard to share. No matter how they spoke, no matter how they healed the sick and performed miracles, the people refused to listen. Their hearts were cold, hard, and unyielding, like stones that had been left in the sun for too long. Peter, the most outspoken of the disciples, was the first to voice what they were all feeling. His face was flushed with frustration, and his hands were clenched tightly into fists. "Master," he said, his voice filled with both anger and sorrow, "we did everything we could. We spoke with kindness, we prayed for them, we healed the sick among them, but their hearts were as hard as stone. What more could we have done? How can we change people who are so unwilling to be moved?" The other disciples nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same discouragement and confusion. They had devoted themselves fully to their mission, pouring out their love and energy for the people, only to be met with rejection. It seemed as if the more they tried, the more resistant the villagers became. They longed for a sign that their work was not in vain, that their efforts could make a difference in the lives of those who seemed so unwilling to change. Jesus, who had been quietly listening to their concerns, looked at Peter with a calm and compassionate expression. His eyes, filled with infinite understanding and love, rested on the disciples one by one, as if he could see the weight of their burdens. His gaze then drifted to a large, weathered stone lying at the edge of the path. The stone had been there for as long as any of them could remember, worn and battered by the elements, yet unmoved. It was solid, unyielding, and seemed impervious to the passage of time. "Let me tell you a story," Jesus said softly, his voice gentle but commanding, drawing the disciples' attention as they gathered closer to him, eager to hear the lesson he was about to impart. "There was once a man," Jesus began, "who lived near the base of a great mountain. Every morning he would rise early to tend to his fields. He would pass by a large stone on his way to the fields, a stone much like the one you see here. This stone had been in his path for many years, blocking part of the way, making his journey difficult. The man had grown used to the stone's presence, but one day he decided that he would no longer tolerate it. He made up his mind that he would move the stone, no matter how long it took. The disciples, who had been sitting in quiet reflection, now listened with rapt attention. They could almost see the man in their minds, a simple farmer, determined and strong, ready to take on the challenge of moving the stubborn stone that had hindered his path for so long. At first, Jesus continued, the man tried to move the stone with his bare hands. He pushed with all his might, straining every muscle, but the stone did not budge. Frustrated, he sat down beside the stone and thought, "Perhaps I need a tool to help me." The next day he returned with a large stick, hoping to use it as a lever. He wedged the stick under the stone and pushed with all his strength, but again the stone would not move. Jesus paused for a moment, allowing the disciples to picture this scene. The man, despite his best efforts, was unable to move the stone. But instead of giving up, he remained determined. The disciples could feel the man's frustration in their own hearts, as they had recently experienced the same feelings during their visit to the village. Day after day, Jesus went on, the man returned to the stone. He tried different methods. He dug around it, he brought ropes and pulleys, and he even asked his neighbors to help. But no matter what he did, no matter how many people came to help him, the stone remained firmly in place. It seemed as though it would never move. The disciples exchanged glances, recognizing themselves in the story. They too had faced obstacles that seemed immovable, people whose hearts were hardened and resistant to the message of love they carried. The man grew tired, Jesus said, his voice softening with empathy. He became frustrated. He began to wonder if his efforts were in vain. Why does this stone refuse to move? He asked himself. I have tried everything, yet it stays where it is, unmoved. What am I doing wrong? The disciples' hearts stirred with empathy for the man in the story. They had asked themselves the same questions. What were they doing wrong? Why did their efforts seem to fall on deaf ears? But, Jesus continued, the man did not give up. Something deep within him kept him returning to the stone, day after day. He continued to push, to pull, to try new methods, even though the stone remained in its place. And as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The disciples leaned in closer, their curiosity piqued. What was this remarkable thing that happened? At first, Jesus said, the man's neighbors laughed at him. They saw him struggling with the stone and mocked him. Why do you waste your time? They asked. The stone will never move. It has been there for generations, and it will be there long after you are gone. But the man ignored their taunts and continued his work. And slowly over time the laughter began to die down. His neighbors, seeing his persistence, grew curious. They began to gather around the stone each day to watch him work. Some even began to offer suggestions, while others brought him food and water to sustain him during his labor. Jesus paused again, letting his words sink in. The disciples could almost see the scene unfolding before them. The man, worn and weary but determined, and the growing crowd of neighbors watching, some still skeptical, others beginning to admire his persistence. Eventually, Jesus said, the man's persistence began to inspire others. One by one, his neighbors began to join him. They no longer mocked him. Instead, they admired his resolve. They brought tools to help him, and together they worked to move the stone. Though the stone still did not budge, something even more remarkable was happening. The man and his neighbors, who had once been divided, were now united in a common goal. They began to talk with one another, to laugh together, to share stories of their lives. They became a community. The disciples, who had been listening intently, began to understand the deeper meaning of the story. This was not just about a man trying to move a stone. It was about the power of persistence, of love, and of the relationships that form when people come together with a shared purpose. Jesus smiled gently as he continued. Though the stone never moved, the man and his neighbors were changed. Their hearts, which had once been as cold and hard as the stone itself, were softened by their shared labor, their shared laughter, and their shared love. What had started as a single man's determination to move a stone had transformed an entire community. The disciples sat in silence, reflecting on the profound meaning of the story. They realized that, just as the man's persistence had transformed his community, their own persistence in spreading the message of love could soften even the hardest of hearts. Even if they did not see immediate results, they were planting seeds of change that would one day bear fruit. But Master, John asked, his voice filled with curiosity, did the stone ever move? Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with compassion and understanding. No, John, he said softly, the stone remained where it was. But the man realized that it wasn't the stone that needed to move. It was his heart and the hearts of his neighbors that had been transformed. The stone, which had once seemed like an obstacle, became a symbol of their perseverance, their unity, and their love. Peter, who had been listening quietly, felt his frustration begin to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of peace. He realized that the mission they had been given was not about forcing people to change, but about loving them persistently, even when their hearts seemed as hard as stone. So it is with the people we meet. Peter said, his voice filled with newfound understanding. Even if their hearts seem hard and unmovable, our kindness and persistence can soften them over time. Jesus nodded, his expression full of love and approval. Yes, Peter. It is not force that will change hearts, but love, patience, and persistence. Some hearts, like the stone, may not move right away, but every act of kindness, every patient word, slowly wears away at the hardness, just as water, over time, can carve its way through the strongest rock. The disciples, moved by the wisdom of Jesus' words, felt a deep sense of peace settle into their hearts. They understood now that their mission was not about immediate results, but about faithfully showing love, day by day, even when it seemed that nothing was changing. As the sun began to set behind the hills, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape, Jesus spoke one final time, his voice filled with emotion. Never grow weary of doing good. Do not be discouraged by those who seem unmoved or unchangeable. Every act of love, every patient moment, is shaping the world, and your own hearts, more than you can ever know. Even when you cannot see it, know that your persistence is making a difference. The disciples sat in silence, their hearts full of a new understanding. They realized that the journey they were on would not always be easy. There would be times when they faced rejection, times when people's hearts seemed as hard as stones. But they also knew that their mission was not about moving stones, it was about planting seeds of love and hope, trusting that in time, those seeds would take root and bear fruit. Peter looked down at the large, weathered stone at the edge of the path. It no longer seemed like an obstacle to him. Instead, it was a reminder of the lesson they had just learned, a lesson that would guide them for the rest of their lives. And as they rose to continue their journey with Jesus, they carried with them not just the message of the kingdom, but the quiet, unshakable truth that love, patient, persistent, and kind, could shape even the most stubborn hearts, just as water shapes stone. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.